Alan Dershowitz is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. This is his 50th year at Harvard. He's written more than 1,000 articles, 30 works of fiction and nonfiction. He has received the William O. Douglas First Amendment Award and numerous honorary Doctor of Law degrees and prestigious fellowships. He will be retiring from the Harvard Law School at the end of his 50th year there, and from all I can tell from my discussions with him, starting his next career. Alan and I have worked together. He was my teacher. We arrived the same time at Harvard Law School, he as a professor and me as a first-year student. He quickly became known as America's lawyer of last resort. Various other people call him various other names and titles, as you know. He is erroneously dubbed a celebrity lawyer. He's actually a lawyer for an enormous range of people. Most of the cases that I've known that Alan has done, he's done pro bono. Those are not the ones generally that get the publicity. He is a phenomenon, and it's my pleasure to be his interlocutor, I suppose, his Charlie Rose at the program today. So Alan Dershowitz, the author of his autobiography, My Life, Taking the Stand, My Life in the Law. And I am going to ask Alan some questions seated next to him and hope to have a conversation. And then at some point, you will be invited to join that conversation with comments and with questions. First thing, Alan, I just want to compliment you on the jacket photograph of your book. You look terrific, although my wife took your first photograph of your first book in the jacket, and of course that was the best defense. You looked somewhat younger there. Maybe she's a better photographer.
She is.
And but aside from the front of the jacket, I was intrigued by the back of the jacket because half the comments on the back about you are comments about what a scalawag you are and worse. So would you perhaps start out by telling us who wrote whose idea was it to have the negative comments as well as the positive on the back of your autobiography?
Thank you, Harvey. First, it was definitely my idea, and my publisher resisted it at first. Who ever heard of negative blurbs? I mean, the first blurb to sell a book is, I don't read Dershowitz, President Jimmy Carter. But I love my enemies list. I think you judge a person not so much by their friends, but by their enemies. And boy, do I have a great enemies list. And I am controversial. I don't try to hide that. So I put all my enemies on the back cover of my book, telling people what they think of me. I'm a war criminal. I'm deranged. I'm not bright. I'm an enemy of Israel. That's one of my favorites. And then I have responses. Of course, I always have to get the last word. So after President Carter doesn't read me, I have President Obama and President Clinton who do. And, other people who say nice things about me. But my enemies list is really one of my proudest possessions. I've earned them. I mean, I've earned them. And they're legitimate enemies. So
I'm sure they're thrilled to know they're helping to sell your book.
Yeah. That's the best revenge, right?
I have another sort of preliminary question, and that is, you're, of course, you're a lot of things, but one of the things you are is a criminal defense lawyer. And you have had a lot of clients, Some of the clients have been nice people, some not nice people, some innocent, some guilty, and some somewhere in between.
Right.
I noticed that you've spoken in this book about a lot of your clients, sometimes in terms that aren't so complimentary. And we've discussed this issue before, but I'll ask you for the audience, where do you draw the line, given that you're a lawyer, there's a lawyer-client privilege, where do you draw the line between, being silent about a client and saying something that is maybe too revelatory or revelatory and not always complimentary?
It's a great question, and I think about it a lot. Of course, I would never reveal a lawyer-client confidence unless my client wanted me to. Klaus von Bülow wanted me to. He urged me to write a book, and I said I would not write a book about the case if he had last word on it. He'd have to trust me, and he said he trusted me. And there were one or two things in the book that were arguably privileged, and of course I called him in advance and said, I think this would be an interesting thing to say. For example, that he never intended to serve his sentence. Had he been sentenced to jail, he said he would do what a British gentleman is always given permission to do, go into a room with a gun and kill himself. He allowed me to say that because he felt that was the right thing to do. He claimed innocence, and he was not going to serve his sentence in the Rhode Island House of Detention. So maybe he said that to me because he wanted me to consider this a death case, which I did, a death penalty case. I knew he was facing death if we lost the appeal. But that was one example. Giving you an example of somebody I didn't check with for two reasons. Leona Helmsley. First of all, she's dead. And second of all, what I reported on happened in a public place for everybody to see. So I never would disclose anything that happened in private. In the public place, which I describe in the book, she and I were sitting like Harvey and I are sitting, and it was in a hotel. And a poor little waiter came and served me a cup of tea, and in the tea, in the saucer, a little water had spilled. I didn't even notice it. She got outraged. She grabbed the saucer and the cup from me. She threw it against the ground, a marble ground. It broke into dozens of pieces, and then she screamed at the top of her lungs at the waiter, "Get on your hands and knees and beg me for your job." And I said to Leona, I will never again be seen with you in public. I am your lawyer. I will represent you in court. I don't like you. I don't approve of the way you treat people. And that was the end of any kind of a relationship. I continued to defend her in court. We won the state appeal, which reduced her sentence basically by 3 or 4 years. But she was not a person that I want to be associated with. It's amazing. People wonder how nice or decent clients are. One of the nicest clients I ever had, in terms of just basic decency, how he treated other people, Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson. Yes, he chewed off the ear of a guy he was boxing, but when he would call me at night, when he would have to wait online an hour and a half in prison to wait online to get to the phone, and he called me and he'd hear my daughter, who was then 2 or 3, crying in the background. He'd say, "Oh, Alan, your daughter's," he had a high-pitched voice, "your daughter is crying." I said, no, I can talk to you, Mike. No, I'll get back on the line. And he hung up the phone and he would get back on the line. When he was in jail and he had no money and resources, he borrowed money to send turkeys to all of his neighbors for Thanksgiving and Christmas, because that's what he had always done. And, very troubled, very difficult guy, but in terms of being a decent man, he was such a decent man. I would not say that about Leona Helmsley in her public life. Those are the kinds of revelations I'm prepared to make. I wish there were more stories I could tell, but many of them, unfortunately, every lawyer has to go to their grave with.
When did you realize that you would become a public figure? And second question, maybe it's related to the first, maybe it's the same as the first. When did you feel comfortable in that role?
I don't think I've ever felt comfortable in that role. It's so complicated. People go over to you at the airport and they say, "I know who you are." And I say, "Hi, I'm Alan Dershowitz." And they say, No, I know who you are. They don't believe you. Or person, when I was representing Mike Tyson, at the same time I was representing Mike Milken, people would run over to me at the airport and hug me and say, I love you, I love you. I could always tell which Mike they liked, and it was never the same one. And I always tell people when they hug me and love me because of who I'm representing, they shouldn't love me. They're going to hate me tomorrow. Today they like who I'm representing, tomorrow they don't. So it's always awkward. One of the reasons I love sometimes to travel abroad is because I'm just not recognized. It's also nice to be in Cambridge because nobody's a public figure in Cambridge. Everybody is well known and nobody cares. In New York, it's sometimes troubling. For example, I go to the Metropolitan Opera a lot, and I always go at the last minute. And I'm also a little bit of a cheapskate, and so I like to get my tickets inexpensively if I can, so I stand outside the Met, and I hold up a little sign saying, anybody have a ticket for sale or an extra ticket? And people look at me, are you Alan Dershowitz? You're standing, I mean, don't you have access to all the tickets you want? No, I'm just an ordinary kid who grew up in Brooklyn, and I'm trying to get into the Metropolitan Opera. You have a ticket? In fact, one woman came over to me and I asked her, would you sell me a ticket? She said, sell you? No, I would never sell you a ticket. But if you were an appropriate person, I would give you a ticket. She said, who are you? I said my name. She didn't know. She said, what are you? I said, well, I was young. Then I said, I was an assistant professor at Harvard. She said, you'll do. She put her arm through mine, and she took me to her box seats, which had her name on the box, and it was her late husband's seat and hers. And we sat through the opera, and then at the end she said, you seem to like opera a lot. And I said, I do. She said, well, I'm going down to Palm Beach for the season. Would you care for my remaining tickets for the winter? And she gave me these 4 remaining box seats for the Metropolitan Opera. Sometimes it works out very well. But when did I first realize I was a public figure? I think it was during the Von Bulow case, when people start calling me to be on TV and comment on other cases. Most talking heads on television about law have no idea what they're talking about. They really should come with disclaimers, a little sign that says, I have been hired because I'm pretty or handsome. I know nothing about the law. I've never litigated a complex case, but I can make people happy by my smile. Please do not take seriously anything I say about the law. And I mean, that's just true of so many talking heads on television. And how do you become a talking head? You're involved in a big case and you really lose bad. So Marcia Clark, Darden, they had one case in their life. They messed it up to a fairly well. They're now telling people how to litigate cases. My favorite is Mickey Sherman. Mickey Sherman, one big major case, the Skakel case. Not only does he lose it, but he's found ineffective assistance of counsel, but he's the major talking head telling other lawyers and criticizing other lawyers for what they've done. Mickey Sherman actually is not a bad talking head, but he is so typical of who they put on television. And it's a scandal. People like Jeff Toobin are terrific, but others are not. And people who would just go on television every night and say things about the law that are wrong. I've given up. I used to write to CNN and Fox and CNBC saying, what he said was just absolutely categorically. He doesn't understand the double jeopardy clause. He's communicating it wrong. He doesn't understand the defense of self-defense. That came up particularly in the Trayvon Martin and the George Zimmerman case. The talking heads just did not know what self-defense was about. And they were just mouthing off on issues that were unrelated. Just they're emotional. Everybody took sides in that case. And the role of a talking head is to be informative, and they were not informative.
I'm going to toggle back and forth between your various careers. And I'd like to ask you why you stayed at Harvard Law School for 50 years. That's unusual. There's a lot of travel within the academic profession. You've been there your whole teaching career.
Yeah.
And I'd like to know what made you stay there.
Well, first, why did I go there? I had gone to Yale Law School, and both Yale and Harvard offered me jobs when I graduated. And I really thought I'd go to Harvard to get 3 years of postgraduate education, to sit at the feet of Paul Freund and Henry Hart and some of the great, really giants of the law. I'd go there for 3 years. I'd get offered tenure, hopefully, and have an offer from Yale and go to Yale, which is where I thought I belonged. In fact, Alex Bickle, who was my mentor at Yale and who had been turned down for a professorship at Harvard, said, "Don't go to Harvard. You'll never fit in there." When I told that story this year to Charles Fried, he said, "Well, he was right. You've never fit in to Harvard." But I came to Harvard, and I just loved it. I loved meeting students like Harvey Silverglate, who came to my office the first semester he was there saying he wanted to drop out, he hated law, he wanted to be a journalist. And I saw in this guy just enormous talent and creativity. And I urged him to stay on. And the rest is history. He became, one of the great, great criminal lawyers of our generation, one of the great authors of our generation. His book, 3 Felonies a Day, is earth-moving, is conceptual changing. It really makes people think so hard about the function of our criminal justice system. So I love that. And the thing that I thought would happen at Harvard, and I worried about, is that they would try to change me. And there were a couple of professors. Paul Bator said to me one day, "You know, you wear your Jewishness on your sleeve. That's not the Harvard way." And I said, "Look, Paul, I am what I am. You have to take me as I am or not." But nobody really tried to change me. And they allowed me to be the iconoclast that I am, not to fit in. And I really enjoyed being at Harvard. And it is true that at that school, we do, when I look out at an audience, I teach a class about this size, I don't just see 100 students. I see the future President of the United States. There she is sitting in the back of the class. I see the future Chief Justice. I see the future publisher of the New York Times, the future chief correspondent of CNN, the future head of Goldman Sachs. I mean, I know I'm teaching the future leaders of the world. It's an enormous responsibility, an enormous treat to be able to do that. Now, I don't take responsibility for all my students. One of the best students in my class was Ted Cruz. Came into the class with his right hand up, never put it down once during the semester, and was a brilliant student. I offer no comment at this point about his role as a United States a senator. That's for the electorate in Texas to judge. I also had Eliot Spitzer, and all of his problems were my fault, because one day he worked so hard for me as a research assistant. He never rested. He never took time off. I said, Eliot, have fun. Do something. Little did I know. Life is, and Harvard gave me an opportunity. I have a terrible illness called FOMS, fear of missing something. So I never wanted to decide whether I wanted to be a teacher, a litigator, a popular book writer, a talk show person, a public intellectual, a lecturer. At Harvard, I didn't have to decide. I could be all of those things and never have to make a decision or a choice. And the only choice I've made at Harvard, really, is to quit after 50 years. And, I don't know whether I'm going to regret it or not. I taught a class today, 18-year-old Harvard freshman, about where does your morality come from. And I just love it. I assigned the students an article I had written about torture warrants, making them all criticize it. Nobody was allowed to agree with it. They had to find the best arguments for proving I was wrong. And I love that. We had such a good exchange in class. I'm going to miss it, but 50 years is a long time, and I have other things to do in my life. People ask me all the time, is there anything that you haven't done you'd like to do? My answer is, well, I'll do it. If I haven't done it yet, I want to still do it. I don't want to die not having done everything that I want to do.
Well, since you raised torture warrants, I'd like to ask a couple of questions about that. That was actually the subject the last time that you and I appeared together here at the Fort Hall Forum. We were debating torture warrants.
Debating? We were practically with fisticuffs. I mean, that was a really tough debate.
It was a spirited disagreement, which we still have.
Right.
And I'd like to first ask you, first of all, to explain to the audience, for those who might not remember the last occasion, what your view is on why there should be a torture warrant procedure and how you can justify it.
Okay. I'm against torture. I'm opposed to torture. I'm also opposed to the death penalty. But I think we have to have accountability. We're executing people. As long as we are executing people, I want to make sure there are execution warrants. I want to make sure that due process is followed. I take the same view about torture, and I'll explain why it's different. Of course, torture is illegal. The death penalty is legal. It shouldn't be, but it is. For my mind, I don't care what any president of the United States says or promises. If we ever did have a real ticking bomb case where the United States president had intelligence saying there is a nuclear weapon in Boston Harbor or New York Harbor, or there is another potential mass terrorist attack like 9/11, we have in custody the man who spearheaded it and brainstormed the attack and knows where the bomb is or knows where the terrorists are. He won't cooperate. We've given him immunity. We've offered him money. We've threatened him. We've done everything. We really, really need to have a few hours with him, a la Jack, what was his name from 24? Bauer, Jack Bauer from 24. I assure you that every president of the United States would do what President Bill Clinton had the guts to say he would have done. President Bill Clinton, on an NPR interview, said he would have sought congressional approval. He would have tried to get permission of the highest authorities, the justices, or whatever. But in the end, if he had to choose between allowing a mass casualty terrorist attack or authorizing the torture of a guilty terrorist who was determined to destroy the United States, he would choose the torture option. I believe every president would do that. And if I'm right empirically, that's an empirical point, not a normative point. I'm not saying that should be done. I'm saying that would be done. If that would be done, I want to make sure it's not done by Jack Bauer, by some low-level intelligence officer. I want to make sure that Jack Bauer approves it, then it gets approved by the head of the CIA, and then it gets approved by the president and the chief justice. I want to make sure it goes up the line. I want to know who's responsible. I want to know who should be held accountable. I want to know that if it wasn't so necessary, if they did it like the NSA is now doing, going after people who are not necessary to our intelligence, I want to know who to point the finger of responsibility at. I think in a democracy, accountability is very important. Having said that, I understand it has a lot of negatives. It could tend to legitimate torture, and that's a cost. But I weigh that cost against accountability. I think it's a close question, and I side on the side of accountability. Having written that, I got more pushback, more controversial, critical statements about that article than probably anything I've ever written. I would say 90% of the academics said I was wrong, and they may be right. I stimulated a debate. I started a debate. I think it's a healthy debate. I think that's part of the role of an academic. And I do maintain the position that given a choice between seeing it done surreptitiously without accountability, which would happen, or seeing it done with some degree of accountability, I opt for accountability. What's your view?
Well, I remember that we had this debate in the Boston Phoenix.
Right,
we had
right.
it here, and my view was that it was going to result in much more torture, and that what we should really do is outlaw the practice, and if we find somebody has done it, we should charge the person, have a trial, and the jury, you ever hear of jury nullification? It actually happens. If the reason that the person violated the law and actually inflicted torture was a reason that the society generally would think it was worth it, the jury would never convict. You need, as you know, 12 out of 12.
Yeah, look, that's a good point.
I doubt you could get a jury to convict. And so I would rather leave it like that. We had this very
discussion,
similar
right?
discussion with regard to campus speech codes.
Before we get to campus speech codes, let me just answer you about the jury. I think you're half right about the jury. I think if, in fact...
Not 60%?
No. Let me tell you why I think it's half, maybe 40%. Let me explain why. I think if the agent turned out to be right, and he did prevent a terrorist attack, and that could be demonstrated, of course you're right, he'd win. Jury would not only acquit him unanimously, they'd give him a Medal of Honor. What if he turned out to be wrong? What if he tortured somebody, and it turned out he had the wrong guy? But he had the basis for it. I mean, I much prefer ex-ante decisions. That's why I prefer search warrants to having trials. In fact, the reason we have a search warrant in our Constitution under the Fourth Amendment is precisely to protect constables and police against the possibility of a lawsuit. The warrant gives them the protection. So if they have the warrant, that means if they now have probable cause, but it turns out they're wrong and they're sued, they can't be sued. So I'm doing this to protect the agent who made a reasonable decision based on what he knew at the time, but turned out to be wrong.
So let's apply this reasoning
Okay.
to this other issue that you and I have been debating forever, and that is campus speech codes. I
Right.
think that these are totally inappropriate for colleges and universities, liberal education. And as long as the college enacts a speech code, college administrators are going to punish students for saying what's on their mind, sometimes for saying so politically incorrectly. And yet you were in favor of a speech code at Harvard.
Right.
Could you explain that?
Yeah.
Defend yourself, I
Okay,
guess.
so Harvey and I share a common disdain for any form of censorship and a common love for complete freedom of expression. And the question is, which achieves it better? So my point is that there are, in fact, certain types of speech that every university would ban. Let me give you an example. If there were a professor who got up in front of the class and decided to call on women students by calling them chicks or dames or babes, or decided to call on African American students by using a terrible word, or every Jew, oh, hey, kike, what's your answer, kike? No teacher would ever be tolerated doing that. So if I'm right that there are certain words in certain contexts that should be banned, why don't we decide that in advance? And then, if we decide that in advance, that limits what can be punished. If it's not in the code, then it can't be punished. Whereas if you say, let's leave it to the discretion of the dean, because we know the dean could fire any professor who used the K word or the N word or the whatever word is inappropriate for whatever group. We know the dean has discretion to do that. I just don't trust decanal discretion. I don't trust deans, I don't trust university presidents, and I certainly don't trust after-the-fact decisions when there's already been a riot on the campus. Oh my God, look at what happened. This person used that word. That's why I prefer rational decision-making before any of this happens and decide on the 7 words, the 11 words. We tried that at Harvard, by the way, when we had a real racial conflict, and they appointed me to the committee. And in the end, nobody could agree on the words, because we even said, what about a teacher who uses the N-word directed at a black student? Well, what if it's a black professor, and he's using it to make a point? One of our professors, one of our colleagues, Randy Kennedy, wrote a book in which she used the N-word in the title, spelled it all out, and saying a word, a dramatic. Would we ban him? Would we censor him? In the end, we could not do a code because nobody could agree. I thought that was a great victory. It was a great heuristic. It said you try to do a code, you couldn't do it. Therefore, nothing should be banned. But what I don't like is after-the-fact decisions made by deans to apply the common law. So given a choice between a code and a common law, I always prefer the code to the common law. Look, if I could have no censorship at all, I would actually prefer to live in a society where a teacher was not banned for using that word against a student and the marketplace of ideas condemned that teacher. But no university I know of would tolerate a teacher doing that. So as long as we do have banned words, I want to know that in advance.
But Harvard College has a code.
It's terrible code.
Terrible
code.
So not all codes are...
Oh, no. Almost no codes are good. My point is, let's have an exercise of writing a code. Let's have input before we pass the code. Harvard's code is any professor who's anything that demeans a student. Mm-hmm. What does demeans mean? I mean, my God, anything could demean a student.
Makes them feel they're not the most important person in the world.
Right. Especially a Harvard student. My God. Not getting an A+ demeans the student.
Let me turn off the campus and out of the courtroom for a minute. Since I've been there and sort of seen you through your whole career, haven't been at every battle, but
Right.
I've seen many of them.
You've been at virtually every one of them, and you've stood at my side on all the hard battles. I've stood at your side at a few of them too. So.
But I do remember one conversation we had that you touch upon the issue in your book, and I'd like to ask a little bit more about it. For many years after you moved to Cambridge, you rented a house. And I used to be curious about the fact you had, at some point, you had rather big houses. I assume that Harvard, I think, owned a couple of them. The rent must have been somewhat expensive. And then all of a sudden, there was a change. You bought a house in Cambridge, you bought a house in the Vineyard, and I want to know whether there was what change happened in your life, your psyche, that suddenly...
Very simple. BC and AC. BC is before Carolyn Cohen, my wife, and AC is after Carolyn Cohen. I met my wife in December of 1982 at an event like this. I spotted her in the audience toward the back. I fell in love with her on the spot. I ran out after the speech to try to get her name and number. She wouldn't give me her number, but she gave me her name, and it was Carolyn Cohen. I called the first Carolyn Cohen and asked her out that night, and she said, sure, but you have to bring me home to the home before 9 o'clock. The second Carolyn Cohen said, sure, I'll have dinner with you, but can I bring my husband? And I got her on the third try. And she settled me down. She decided, she said, look, Alan, you have a Holocaust mentality. You think that you can't own anything. I love art, and I always wanted art. She said, you can't, because you have to be able to run away quickly. It's over. There's not going to be another Holocaust in the United States. Buy a house, buy some art. So I did. And, she really changed my life. After meeting her is when I wrote my 30 books, because I had more stability in my life and in my career. I wish she were here tonight so she could hear what I'm saying, but she knows what I feel. So that was the dramatic event in my life. You might ask me about another event, and I find that much harder to explain. When I was 16 and a half years old, I was a high school senior, and I actually have a photograph of my report card in my senior year in this book. And this is my senior year report card, and it's my first half of the last semester. I'm just about to graduate, first half of the last semester. 60 in mathematics with a big red line around it, meaning failure. 65 in Hebrew, it was a Jewish parochial school. 65 in history, and 60 in physics with a red thing around it, and 80 in English. Well, not bad. I had a 67 average. I was suspended from the varsity basketball team for academic failure, not for athletic failure. And I barely squeaked into college. In those days, you could get into Brooklyn College by taking a test. My rabbi, the principal of the school, said to me one day, look, Dershowitz, you got a big mouth, but you have no brain. You should figure out something you can do with your mouth, but not your brain. He said, I have two suggestions. Remember, he was an Orthodox rabbi. He said, one, you could be a conservative rabbi. Or two, you could be a lawyer. I wasn't smart enough to be a rabbi, so I became a lawyer. My history teacher, when I got a 90-something on the Regents in history, he called me and he said, look, Dershowitz, don't let it get to your head. You're a 65 student. You've always been you're a 75 student. You've always been a 75 student. You'll always be a 75 student. And so I said to myself, I can get 75s without working. And why work more if I'm not going to do better? But within 3 months, I was in Brooklyn College getting straight A's. I never got a B in my life. And the remarkable transition from a 16-year-old failure to within 8 years being offered an assistant professorship at probably the greatest university in the world, I still can't get my mind behind that. One of the reasons I wrote this book is to try to figure it out. Again, it may have been a woman. It was during that summer that I met my first wife, Sue, who you knew, and who has since died. But she may have also influenced me settling down. It reminds me of how, I'll tell a wonderful story I tell in the book, about how a Harvard law professor changed history. This is a name-dropping story, name-dropping alert. So in the summer of, I don't remember, 91, 92, when Clinton had just been elected president, 92, 93, just been elected president, he and Hillary came to the Vineyard for a summer vacation toward the end of the summer, and their stay there coincided with Rosh Hashanah, Jewish holiday. And so I invited Bill and Hillary, President Clinton and Hillary Clinton, to come with me and my wife to shul, to synagogue on Martha's Vineyard, and they accepted, becoming the first president ever to go to a Rosh Hashanah service. And afterward, they invited us to dinner. We had dinner, and I said, Hillary, I've always wondered why you went to Yale, not Harvard. And she said, oh, simple, Harvard didn't want me. I said, you mean they turned you down? No, they accepted me. I had a letter from them. I had a letter from Yale. And I went to a Lincoln's Inn Christmas dinner at Harvard with my then boyfriend, not Bill, and I showed the letters to a professor who was there, and I asked him, where do you think I should go? And the professor looked at me and said, ma'am, we have about as many women as we need at Harvard. Yale is much more suited to the intellectual thinkings of women than Harvard is. You should go to Yale. So she went to Yale and met and married Bill, and if that hadn't happened, he never would have been president. So
you tell a story in your book about Judge Bazelon, for whom you clerked, and with whom you had a very close relationship, obviously.
Right.
And Bazelon introduced you to a fellow named Milton Kronheim, a local liquor distributor who you said knew everybody.
Yep.
And you analogized him to the real-life Zelig. I assume most people here have seen the Woody Allen film Zelig.
Great film, great film.
My question to you is whether you are, in fact, reading through your book, I kept saying to myself, well, you know, I've been around for all this time, but I never really realized that he's really the Zelig of our day. Is that a fair characterization of you?
Well, Harvey, I wish I could say you were original, but the New York Times book review, which is coming out this Sunday of the book, is entitled Legal Zelig. Alan Dershowitz has inserted himself into many famous cases and controversies. I'm not sure I like the word inserted. Mostly, always I'm called by people, but I have been involved in many of the great cases. I've been very, very lucky. So it's probably a fair characterization. I just wrote an op-ed that I sent off literally this afternoon in which I write about my Zelig-like view of the assassination of President John Kennedy 50 years ago. And I tell the story in my book. When I was a law clerk, our secretary husband worked for communications in the United States Army, and she was on the phone with him when he said, I have to get off the phone, shots have been fired in Dallas. So we may have been among the first few hundred people in the world to learn about what was happening in Dallas. We turned on the television, nothing. So we thought maybe it was a false alarm. We didn't know. About 5 minutes later, they come on the television saying shots have been fired in Dallas. The president has been rushed away to Parkland Hospital. Nobody knows what happened. But it was a Friday, and the justices all sit in conference on Friday mornings, and there's one rule, never disturb them. They sit alone. There's no secretary. There's no law clerks. They sit alone, only the 9 justices. I had the job of having to go to knock on the door and tell the justices that the president had been shot. Justice Goldberg was the junior justice for whom I was clerking, came to the door and said, Alan, I told you never to interrupt us. Go away. I said, Mr. Justice, you're going to want to know this. Turns out I had the only television set in the Supreme Court. I'm a fanatical baseball fan. By the way, I had champagne poured on my head last Wednesday by David Ortiz. I was in the locker room when the World Series was over. I was at all the World Series games. In any event, I had a little television, a 10-inch black and white TV, in my little cubicle office in the Supreme Court. All the justices, all 9 of them, came into my little cubicle to watch the news. And when they finally announced at about 1 o'clock that the president was reported to be dead, Whizzer White, Justice White, who had been a close friend of the president, just started crying like a baby. The Chief Justice ordered all of the justices out of the Supreme Court, all to be taken by secure armed guards to different locations because he thought there might be a Lincoln-like conspiracy. That next night, Justice Goldberg asked me if I would drive him to the White House because Lyndon Johnson, the new president, wanted to see him, and because he was the only person in Washington who had really, really close connections both to the Johnson family and to the Kennedy family. And so I drove him to the White House, and then I drove him to the funeral the next day. And we were listening on the radio when Oswald was shot by Ruby. And then I was invited to join the Warren Commission as a staff member, and Justice Goldberg told me not to do it, that he had heard from the Chief Justice that the reason the Chief Justice accepted the job is because President Johnson, who had a way of twisting arms, said, I need you to be the head of the commission because I need the American public to know that Oswald acted alone and that it was not a communist plot. The rumor was that it was either Cuba or the Soviet Union, because I don't want to see a rise in McCarthyism or militarism against the Soviet Union. So I need you to convince the American public that Oswald acted alone. And Goldberg said, you don't want to be on a commission whose outcome is already known, even if it's the right outcome. And he urged me not to take the job. And I didn't. And I watched the case very carefully from a distance, the commission, and myself have come to the conclusion, I knew a lot of people, several other law clerks served on it, I think the conclusion they came to was serendipitously correct, that he acted alone, but they were denied a lot of information by the CIA and by intelligence that might have at least caused some questions or doubts. And I think that material was deliberately withheld from the commission in order to avoid doubts. The end result is it has created more doubts than it has avoided. But there I was, Zelig-like, really very, very close. Also, that Sunday, he was killed on a Friday, we were supposed to have our annual football game, law clerks football game, between the judiciary and the executive. Our captain was to be Whizzer White. Their captain was to be Bobby Kennedy, who had played on the Harvard football team. Of course, it was a football game that was never to occur.
I'm going to only ask you two more questions, and then I'm going to open it up the audience. My first question is, you lived through the presidency, Harvard presidency of Larry Summers,
Right.
Which crashed and burned after only 5 years. And I'd like to ask you about the reasons in your mind that Summers ended up resigning. And I suggest three I'd like to hear you talk about. Number one, was it really because of his dispute with women, over his talk about women and their aptitude for science? Was it because of his suggestion that ROTC should be restored to Harvard? Or was it his suggestion that some of the anti-Israel rhetoric that you heard a lot about at Harvard, especially on the faculty, was actually disguised anti-Semitism? Which of those positions taken by Larry Summers do you think was most destructive to his remaining president?
Of the three you mentioned, the answer is all four. The three plus one additional one. He was not good in dealing with people in the university. He did not suffer fools. And let me tell you, Harvard has a surfeit of fools at every position. You cannot believe the incredible lack of common sense that many Harvard faculty and administrators have over the years. I'll tell you one other thing. In 50 years of teaching, I've never met a group of people less courageous than tenured professors who are unprepared to express any views that are politically unpopular. And Larry had guts and had courage. He also was wrong very often. And he was completely wrong, I believe, about the way he expressed his views, and they were really more of questions than they were views regarding women. There are so many other reasons why women may not, at that time, have reached the top ranks of physics and science, and that you deal with causes first that you can address, that you can deal with. And the causes that are curable and addressable are allocation of resources, cultural reasons. You don't get to the possible immutable biological reasons, if there are any at all, which I have real doubts about, at the beginning of your discussion. There's nothing you can do about that. You get to the things that you can do something about, particularly if you're president. I told Larry at one point that there's a hierarchy of free speech at Harvard. Students have the most. Faculty has the second most. Deans have the third most. The president has the least. And we've seen that. We've seen that with various other presidents at BU and elsewhere, and or even at NYU, my former research assistant and friend John Sexton, who's gotten into trouble also for expressing views that are not politically correct. There was a great cartoon, I think it was in the Boston Globe, but it may have been in Los Angeles Times, and it had Larry asking the corporation it was the wrong people, or the faculty saying, no, you misunderstood what I said. The quote was wrong. I didn't say that women are intellectually inferior. What I actually said was that Israel is the worst human rights offender in the world. Now can I have my job back? So I really, what happened is Larry so alienated the hard left at Harvard, particularly the anti-Israel hard left at Harvard, but also the feminist hard left at Harvard, that they were looking for an excuse, and he gave them that excuse. You know, it reminds me of Hillary Clinton saying, there's a vast right-wing conspiracy out there to get my husband. Yeah, so why are you having sex in the Oval Office with a young blabbermouth if there is a vast right-wing conspiracy and it's going to come out? Why are you giving the vast right-wing conspiracy an excuse to go after you? I mean, if people are after you, I mean, I teach my students over and over again, you can go up to the line when it comes to defending others, but when it comes to paying your own taxes, never get even close to the line. People are going after you. Just understand you should make a 10% contribution every year to the IRS. Just don't even get close to lines. Anything that's self-serving, stay away from those lines so you can get closer to the line when you're doing it on behalf of other people. And I think, you know, Larry did a lot of tremendously good things for Harvard. He really improved the status of science at Harvard. He really actually improved the status of women at Harvard. You know, he appointed first woman dean at Harvard Law School. He appointed women deans and other university professors at many other parts of the university. But, you know, look, when I was 35 years old, you may remember this, Harvey, because I may have discussed it with you. When I was 35 years old, I suddenly became well known. I started to write op-eds, and I was well known for a 35-year-old professor. What happens if you're a well-known 35-year-old Harvard professor? Really stupid people at other universities begin to offer you jobs as deans and presidents without concern for whether you'd make a good dean or a good president. So I got a dozen offers of deanships and presidencies of universities when I was about 35, and I laughed. I said, don't they realize the job of a president is to bring people together? I tear people apart. I am not boring. It's true. And presidents should be boring. Harvard now has an incredibly good president. But, you know, she is not known for her stimulating and confrontational statements. She knows what to do as president of the university. She's a great president. She's doing a fantastic job. She's not making any mistakes. So I turned down all my offers for presidencies and for deanships. Larry should have done the same. Larry should have realized he is too smart to be a president and too smart to be in an administrative position where he has to satisfy every constituency at the same time. The alumni, the students, the right, the left, the contributors, the senior faculty, the junior faculty, the deans, the medical school, the law school, and he just was not suited to be president. And I think he did a great job considering all the constraints, but he would have been, look what happened. It's a tragedy. He would have been a great head of the Fed, and I think this statement disqualified him from being head of the Fed as well. I think the person who's replaced him, she will be wonderful as well. And you know, Larry has a great ability too. He does wonders for women because every time he's replaced, he's always replaced by a woman. You always want the anti-Summers. And so at the Fed, they got a woman. At Harvard, they got a woman. You know, if I ever want my daughter or anything to get a job, I'll try to get Larry in there first.
My final question. Your book ends with your posthumous letter to the editor.
Oh, yeah.
And it's quite a piece of work. I read it several times. I was quite interested in the reasons why you included it. But let me ask the question this way, and if the premise of the question is wrong, you'll let me know. Why do you care so much about what people think about you?
Okay, that's a very fair question and a very good question. I care, I think, even more what people think about me when I'm dead than when I'm alive. Why? Because I can't answer back. And now, every time anybody says anything negative about me, hey, I'm there. I can respond. So I like to get the last word. It's probably a little bit of ego. It's a little bit of I am a contentious person. And so I decided I wanted to write a letter to the editor to be published the day after my obituary appears, correcting my obituary, because it's going to get it wrong. It's going to call me a celebrity lawyer. It's going to mention O.J. Simpson and Klaus von Bülow. It won't mention all my pro bono cases. It'll say I'm a zealot on Israel when I, in fact, have always favored the two-state solution. I'm opposed to the settlement policies in Israel. And I've been critical of Israeli policies when warranted. So I wanted to correct the record. Look, I have grandkids. I hope someday to have great-grandkids. I want to leave a little bit of a legacy. By the way, I will end with this story because it's a perfectly appropriate story to end this part of the conversation with, considering how it began. It began with a discussion saying, I'm never boring. Well, one day I was sitting and having lunch with my grandson and my granddaughter. At the time, he was 10, she was 12. And they're both now, one is a Harvard freshman, the other is a Harvard junior. But when I was 10 years old, I asked my grandson, Lyle, how's school? He said, Grandpa, you're the most boring person I know. And my granddaughter, Lori, said, Lyle, you can't say that to your grandfather. And Lyle said, but he is the most boring person I know. And Lori said, I know he is, but you can't say that to your grandfather. So I had dinner with my grandson last night, and I told him that I had put that little story in the book. And he said, you know, you're an acquired taste, Grandpa. He said, you were really boring to me because you didn't know anything about Xboxes. You didn't know anything about all the things I was interested in until I was like 14. You've become a little less boring since. So I appreciate any kind of a backhanded compliment from my grandkids.
All right. Questions from the audience. Come up to the mic, please.
Richard.
I have a Hitler question, but before that, I was waiting for your telling us your prescribed method of torture under your torture ward scenario, which is sterilized needles shoved up under the fingernails, but you never mentioned that.
Yeah, no, I certainly don't want the person to get an infection, God forbid. I'm Jewish, after all. I want to just make him have the most excruciating possible pain. The other choice would be the dental scene from Marathon Man. I just use that to illustrate non-lethal torture. And my question back to anybody is that worse than 50 people being blown up and losing their limbs? Is it worse than the marathon bombing? I leave it to you to judge. But Richie, you had the rest of the question.
You have said that had Hitler managed to escape and made his way into Brazil, South America,
right,
and hung out for 30 or 40 years and finally been caught and indicted and facing trial, and no lawyer had come forth to defend him, that you would be that person to defend him because everyone deserves a legal defense.
Right.
Furthermore, you have said that you would have won your case. Tell us how you would have won. What arguments would you put forth in behalf of Hitler?
Okay, great question. First of all, Richie comes to all of my speeches, and he is really the First Amendment embodiment. He reads everything. He knows all the footnotes of my book, and he always asks very, very good questions. So I think a round of applause for Richie. So that was part of an interview that appeared in Newsweek magazine, I think, when I was speaking at Yale Law School. And it left out the first half of what I said. I said if he had been arrested, if he had called me to be his lawyer in 1943, while the Second World War was going on, I would have agreed. I would have agreed in order to get to see him in his office, and I would have tried to kill him with my bare hands. That would have been the right thing to do. It would have been an act of civil disobedience, and I would have been proud for having killed him, even if it required me losing my own life in the process. I said if he were arrested as an old man and would therefore go free, if no lawyer would represent him, of course I'd represent him. Once I agreed to represent him, of course I'd have to try to win. And the argument I'd make is the argument that should have been made more effectively at the Nuremberg trials, and that is what applicable law was there to try him. The Nuremberg laws were enacted after the crimes. They were retroactive, in effect. And I think a court might very well, modern courts have in fact now adopted that and ruled in his favor. I mean, it really raises the question of what do you do when you have to represent somebody and you have to raise a defense which you find appalling but is available under the law. As a lawyer, you have just no choice. I mean, the question you could ask too would be, what if he had been arrested and in the process of being arrested had been injured and was brought to the emergency room of a hospital? Would a doctor cure him in the emergency ward? I think the answer would be the same. If it was 1943 and I were a doctor, I'd plunge a knife into his heart as an act of civil disobedience and then resign from the medical profession because I had abused the Hippocratic Oath. But if it was the year 2000 and he was 95 years old and he's taken to a hospital, I see no choice that a doctor would have but to do that. I would hope a priest would have done the same thing. A priest, I would hope, would have taken confession from a 90-year-old Hitler, and I would hope, though I'm not sure, that a priest taking confession in 1943 would have had the guts to kill him. Don't know what a priest would have done that, don't know how he would have been treated by the church, but I think to everything there's a season, and there was a season to kill Hitler and a season to represent him if absolutely necessary. Of course, I use the Hitler example to make a point, because everybody has asked me that question over time. It even found its way into the script of the movie Reversal of Fortune. Yeah. Oh, I'm so, okay. Oh, there's nobody here. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. You go.
You two collaborated on another battle back in '72 in defending Sheldon Siegel and the Jewish Defense League. Something that you discussed in the book in various sections, actually. In Chapter 12, you actually said that that was the first time that you had helped free guilty murderers, but it wasn't the last. And it seems to me now that you've been defending Jewish terrorists for the last 40 years.
Jewish terrorists?
Down to the present day, including the present government of Israel, of terrorists and murderers of that apartheid state. Is this something that you've made a practice of and a precedent since '72?
Well, I'm very proud of my defense of Israel. When you talked about terrorism, I thought you were going to say that I represented Hamas.
They're not a terrorist organization.
No, I get your point. I get your point. Israel is the most legitimate state in the history of any state being created. It's the only state that was created as the result of law. When you think of how America was created, it was revolution. How most countries were created, revolution. Israel was created as a result of a variety of treaties, coupled with a UN mandate and declaration, coupled with a declaration of independence, without a single person being killed. Israel was then attacked by every one of the Arab nations, even though a two-state solution had been decreed by the United Nations, and terrorism has ensued ever since. I don't know of any single instance where Israel has willfully and consciously ever killed an innocent person. Now, obviously, when you go after terrorists who are hiding among civilians, inevitably, because their purpose in hiding among civilians is to cause Israel to cause civilian casualties, there will be some civilian casualties. So Israel probably has the best human rights record, certainly better than the United States, of any country ever faced with comparable threats. The ratio of civilians to military killed by Israel is better than in any country in the history of warfare. The total time between 1929 and the current time, when Israel was faced with terrorism, Israel has killed fewer people than the Syrians have killed in 1 year. And yet I have heard no mention by the questioner of Syrian attacks, of Syrian terrorism, or Islamic terrorism. When it comes to apartheid, of course, I was very active in the fight against apartheid. Apartheid means when you have a minority of people controlling the life of a majority, when the majority can't vote, when the majority is treated unequally as a matter of law. In Israel, Arabs are citizens. They have full right to vote. They have a variety of members in the Knesset, of course not ever true of apartheid South Africa. They have complete and total free speech, so much so that when they shout and scream and yell abusive things in the Knesset, they are not punished because they have the full right of parliamentary immunity. Is Israel a perfect country? No. But anyone who singles out only Israel and asks a question only about Israel without saying, what about Tibet? What about what about the Crimean Tatars? What about the Chechens? What about the Kurds? What about the rights of other countries? Anybody who singles out just the Jewish state really has to look himself in the mirror and say, why? Why are you singling out the Jew among nations?
Who are you referring to
for special
specifically that
treatment?
does that? Who are you referring to specifically that only singles out the Jewish state?
You.
Have you heard my opinions on any other subject?
You haven't expressed them.
Have you written a book on the defense of Russia and the Chechen conflict? Have you written a book on the defense of Syria and the Syrian conflict?
You asked me a question which included, as terrorists, only the state of Israel. Obviously encompassed within the question is the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Which started with the Nakba, which was one of the greatest acts of mass terrorism
in
history.
I'll just answer this question, and then this question is obviously over. Let's talk about the Nakba. Okay. The Nakba, I've talked about the Nakba. Let me tell you what the Nakba is. The Nakba means the terrible events that happened. Here's the Nakba. Israel is declared to be a state by Israel with the support of the United Nations, with the endorsement of the United States, the Soviet Union. Virtually every country in the world accepts the two-state solution. Israel is going to be relatively a sliver along the Mediterranean coast, plus the Negev, which is not arable. The Arabs are given 55% of the arable land, 45% of the total land. The part that's called Israel has a majority of Jews in it. The part that's called the Palestinian state has a majority of Arabs in it. That was the solution. What is the Nakba? The Nakba is the result of a decision by all the Arab countries and the Palestinians to invade Israel and engage in a genocidal war. They lost. That's the Nakba.
They were already there. They were already
the
there.
Nakba.
They were forcibly expelled.
Well, but
you've
the
got the
question
Joan
is-
Peters version of it
The
from time
question is,
immemorial.
Would you let him answer
started-
the question,
The question is, who started the war? Who caused the Nakba? If not for the attack by the Arab states on Israel, we would have a two-state solution. None of the Arabs would have been expelled. Yes, I acknowledge that in the course of a war of genocide, started by one side against the other, where 1% of every Israeli died. 1%. 1 out of every 100. Talk about a Nakba. 1 out of every 100, including many Holocaust survivors, many of them civilians, who surrendered, as in the Etzion block, with their hands up. 123 of them mowed down by machine guns with their hands up, men, women, and children. That's the Nakba. Now, as the result of that, obviously, Israel had to clear areas, and the result was that Palestinians left and went 1 mile or 2 miles to join their cousins, aunts, and uncles. That was a tragedy. It's no tragedy compared to what happened to the 3 million Sudeten Germans who were forcibly, with 100,000 of them dying.
What did the Palestinians have to do with that?
Would you let him answer the question?
I'm saying there have been many transfers of populations. Now let's talk about why the Palestinians were at fault as a group. They had a leader. The leader's name was al-Husseini. He was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He was the most popular leader in Palestine. He was regarded as the leader. What did he do? During the Second World War, he went to Berlin. He made a deal with Hitler. He became a complicitous person in the Holocaust. He formed all kinds of legions, Muslim legions, to kill and attack Jews. He planned to build an extermination camp in Israel to kill the remaining Jews of Israel. So don't think that the Palestinian leadership was innocent. The result was, of course, that there were hundreds of thousands of dispossessed Jews who survived the Holocaust. Israel was established, and they opened the doors to the Jews of Europe. Thank goodness for that. But they would have accepted a large Arab population that would have remained there, but for the foolish attack by the Arab countries on Israel. And by the way, the Arab countries weren't attacking Israel for the sake of the Palestinian people. The Jordanians wanted the West Bank, and the Egyptians wanted Gaza and the other areas. So at the very least, there's a lot of fault to go around all over the place. But the idea of calling Israel a terrorist apartheid state is anti-Semitic. When the shoe fits,
it's just
you
a
have
way of
to wear
disguising it.
Right,
So be at Brooklyn College on Friday night, and you'll get the apartheid view.
Okay.
Can
I'm
we
sure
have
there are
the
many.
next question,
There are many
please?
who support your view, and that's why I spend so much of my time criticizing it. By the way, it's interesting that you all know I'm a liberal. I am opposed to the death penalty. I support gay rights, support a woman's right to choose abortion. But on many college campuses, and particularly among people of the kind we've just heard, I am regarded as a rabid right-wing conservative because I support Israel in the way I just expressed my support for Israel. That, in the minds of many college students and many college academics, particularly in the anti-Israel hard left, has turned me into a rabid conservative in their mind, though even from the Israeli perspective, I'm way on the left in Israel and represent and support left governments in Israel rather than right-wing governments in Israel.
Do you have a question? Okay,
Because Benjamin Netanyahu was right about
next
me.
question.
Thank you so much for
By the way,
coming.
Amos Oz, who's the major peacenik in Israel, also endorsed me. So, I'm supported by both the left and the right in Israel. But go ahead. Let's move on to other subjects. Do we have another question here?
Maybe I wasn't standing close enough to the microphone to indicate I wanted to speak. But I'm glad that I got a chance to go after that gentleman. I was afraid I'd sound confrontational with you.
As you can see, I really dislike confrontations.
I wanted to ask you both, actually, about a topic about which you appear to disagree, at least based on recent publications. And it's not world, it's much more local. It's very local here to Beacon Hill. And that's the subject of William Bulger. We've obviously had the completion of the well-publicized trial of Whitey Bulger, and each of you have a different opinion, yet you have the same shared experience. Both of you represented Harold Brown. Both of you attended the Governor's Council hearing in 1990. Same perspectives. You were subject to the same criticisms that he levied upon both of you. And I wanted to know, how do you walk away from that, having views that are so differing from one another? And I don't want to mischaracterize them, but I believe the presumption of innocence isn't afforded as liberally as you have afforded it to many of your clients when it comes to Bill Bulger's
You talking to me
role.
now?
Yes.
As far as Bulger is concerned?
William Bulger.
William Bulger. Oh, yeah. No, I'm happy to answer that. Everybody's presumed innocent in court, but nobody is presumed innocent by history. In history, you have to look at events. Whitey Bulger could not have become the major crime figure he was without the active support of William Bulger. William Bulger is the godfather. Whitey Bulger is the hitman. Whitey Bulger is the lieutenant, maybe the captain. But William Bulger is the man who ran the mob in Massachusetts for all these years. Nothing happened in Massachusetts without acknowledgement of what William Bulger needed and wanted. We found out about that when we found out that Harold Brown could not build a building in Boston unless $500,000 was paid as a bribe to William Bulger. He received half of it. His law partner, another person, received another half. I'm waiting for him to sue me, by the way, for defamation. I've said all these things in public. When my book was published, in which I say these things again, the publisher said, well, aren't you worried he'd sue you for defamation? I said, I can't wait. I get discovery, I get him to commit perjury, and he finally goes to jail. Let's not understate what he did. Here's the way it worked. It was very clear that in order to be in the favor of Billy Bulger, you had to protect Whitey Bulger. That was true of Jeremiah O'Sullivan, who was the head of the strike force of the Justice Department here, who was the one who knew that Whitey Bulger was an informer and was his guy, and was also the guy who found, miraculously, that Billy Bulger hadn't committed any crimes during the State Street investigation, when it was clear that he had accepted a bribe of all that money. It was a fix. O'Sullivan fixed the case, it was Billy Bulger who got William Connolly. Is it William? John Connolly. I'm sorry, John Connolly, to become Whitey Bulger's protector, and Connolly ultimately became a murderer. He's one of the heads of the FBI here in Boston, but he was the one who tipped off Whitey Bulger as to who was ratting on him so he could murder them. And he's now in jail, hopefully for the rest of his life, for essentially accessory to murder. And how do you think they got together? They got together because Connolly was a great admirer of William Bulger. William Bulger helped Connolly get the job he got. William Bulger told everybody in the FBI, look, you retire at 55 or whatever, you have a career after this, I'll get you jobs. I'll get you jobs as security people in this company and that company, and he did. He helped Connolly get a job, and Connolly's job, in addition to the paying one he had, was to protect Whitey Bulger. And he did that, and he reported back, obviously, to his godfather, Billy Bulger. And this was the most corrupt place. When I started practicing law here, I told my students, do not go into real estate. You can't do it, honestly. Billy Bulger claimed to control the courts. And he did. He got his people appointed. And he told Mike Dukakis who to appoint to the courts. He told Bill Weld. He got calls from President Clinton. It was just disgraceful how much deference was paid to this godfather. And thank God the city of Boston is rid of it. We've had the most honest mayor of any city in the country, Menino, who is just a godsend. He has rooted out corruption at every point. He is the anti-Bulger in every possible way. I know I will miss him enormously. I think the city of Boston will miss him enormously. I have no comment. I don't know anything about the new mayor, but I can tell you about the old mayor. He is absolutely fantastic, and he's exactly what we needed after the reign of terror. That was Billy Bulger and Whitey Bulger. Billy Bulger got Whitey Bulger out of jail. Billy Bulger knew where Whitey Bulger was. You know where he was living? Around the corner from Billy Bulger's daughter, in the open. Why do you think he picked Santa Monica? And if you don't think Billy Bulger knew where he was, now where Harvey and I disagree, and we may have a little bit of more agreement than you think, is I think it was wrong. I agree with Harvey that it was wrong to fire Billy Bulger from the university job because he wouldn't rat out his brother. Okay, I will buy that. But there are a million other reasons. I mean, first of all, the very idea that William Bulger should be the president of a university is amazing. I mean, it's almost as bad as the McCormack building being named after Speaker McCormack. Speaker McCormack should have been in that courthouse, but he should have been in the dock. He should have been tried for corruption. Instead, they named a courthouse after him, and they named Billy Bulger the president of the University of Massachusetts. What a wonderful city we live in.
I know it's not a debate. Can I just have one quick comment?
Sure, please.
I didn't want to interrupt you before. I know it's frustrating. But when Bulger appeared before Congress in 2003, there were several affidavits that were submitted under the pains and penalties of perjury, and one of those affidavits was one by your client, the one you claim had been extorted by William Bulger, asserting in the document under the pains and penalties of perjury that William Bulger had no role whatsoever in being extorted. And there was a second affidavit from Carl Guston, who represented the Boston Gas, Boston Edison, whatever it was at the time, and he similarly asserted that Bulger had no role in trying to secure a job for Connolly. So.
That's very interesting. I wish I could reveal to you lawyer-client confidences. I can't. I can only tell you this, that one night when I was going after Billy Bulger in Boston Magazine, I got a phone call late at night, and it says, when you're going after Billy, you're going after Whitey, watch your back. Those calls were common. Those calls were frequent. They were made, and it's documented in the two books that have recently been written about the Bulger brothers. They were made to mayoral candidates. They were made to people running for various offices. They were made to people running against Billy Bulger. There was a reign of terror. People were terrified that if they brought lawsuits, if they objected, if they complained, they would get killed. And I'm not specifying anything about any particular person or any particular client, but anything you hear positive about the Bulgers in that connection, particularly while Whitey Bulger was out there, just take with a grain of salt.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for coming. When you started your careers, both of you, you were these larger-than-life geniuses, and with these values
With a C-
and
average,
inspired.
huh?
But you inspired so many young people to go to law school for the right reasons, and yet here you are. You've walked the walk, talked the talk, and you're still who you are, and I just think that's very inspirational.
Thank you.
Professor, my favorite thing you ever did was to invite Red Auerbach to Harvard Law School. His subject was very tangentially related to, it was about how free agency had ruined sports, and he was such a, and you, I think, understood what a visionary he was, and I thought the Celtics were your team, not the Red Sox, but
Both.
I see you at the games.
I know. I'm at both, yeah.
But anyway, my questions to you are: both of you have chosen these two very different paths with all of your skill and your legal acumen, private practice and academia. I wondered if either of you had ever seriously considered the other's path, and if not, why not? And Professor, I had one more question. What did you think of Ron Silver's portrayal of you? Because I thought that John Travolta was terrible as Jan Slickman, but I don't think he had any control over it. He was really wrong for that. I just wondered what you thought of his portrayal of you.
Thank you for your great question. Harvey, do you want to start?
Actually, Alan, although he has a photographic memory, might not remember this discussion because it made tremendous impression in my mind. But Alan and I actually had a discussion. I think that we were both in our 30s at the time. We had a discussion about career paths, and Alan was interested back then in playing out his career or careers on a larger stage than I was. And we actually agreed we were going to have different career paths. Mm-hmm. And we did. I had a much more limited path, much more limited vision. Alan took on the world. I had a few causes. And I think that there are probably reasons for that based upon our background way before we were in our 30s. I did have some doubt about being a lawyer. I actually was going to quit law school. Alan talked me into staying and got me a job with a Boston law firm that showed me that the practice of criminal law was indeed a terrific place for me. But so I mean, that's you remember those discussions, Alan.
Yep.
We did have them. This was not totally without thought that we had these different careers. That said, there was quite a bit of overlap.
Yeah. But isn't it remarkable? Two kids from Brooklyn, both from relatively immigrant poor families, and we're making decisions about whether we're going to confront the whole world or whether we're going to just keep our practice limited. You've had such a big impact. I recently had a case I thought about my grandmother. I was asked to represent the former president of the Ukraine, Kuchma, in a potential murder case. And I just thought, Grandma from the Ukraine, I'm representing the president now. And I made a deal with him. I said, if I get you off, you have to try to change the currency of the Ukraine, which on the $5 bill still has a picture of Khmelnytsky, who was a butcher who murdered 100,000 Jewish women, men, and children, and we're still trying to get that changed. But our lives have gone in remarkably similar and different directions. I wanted to respond to the Red Auerbach. One of the most fortunate things that happened to me, even before I came to Boston, is when I was clerking for Judge David Bazelon, his handball partner was Red Auerbach, who lived in Washington. And when I came to Boston, David Bazelon said to Red Auerbach, you got to take this kid under your wings. And he got me basketball tickets, and he would always want to talk to me about law cases. He would say, hey, what's going on with that Van Bulow guy? What's going on with this guy? And I would like to talk to him about basketball. Hey, why are you putting Johnson at guard? He's too slow in bringing the ball up. He said, I don't want to talk to you about that. I don't want to talk to you about that. I said, Red, it's not fair. You want to talk to me about law. I want to talk to you about basketball. You get to talk to me about law. I don't get to talk to you about basketball. He says, it's fair. I said, why is it fair? He says, the law is about people, juries. You want to know what the average person thinks. Basketball is about experts. What the hell do you know about basketball? What do I care about your views? And that's typical Red. I brought him to Harvard Law School because I have a class I teach on professional responsibility. It's a third-year class. And I bring people to class, like I bring Harvey every year, for two reasons. One, they have something to add to the class. Second, I want the students to meet role models. I want the students to see people who've lived lives to the full, people who have been creative, people who have done amazing things. And Red Auerbach fit that description. I just wanted the students to meet the most remarkable basketball coach in history. And he lectured them, and he talked about sports. But that was the one message. The meta message was, this is Red Auerbach. This is a man who's excelled. And you should all try and aspire to become the Red Auerbach of whatever you're doing. So he was a great, great man. I love him. I miss him all the time.
Agreed with him about free agency, but he was he was right. He was absolutely right. It ruined sports.
He was a great
But Ron
guy.
Silver, that's a silly
You know,
question,
Ron
but
Silver, in the movies, you always get overplayed.
Did they
As
ask
you
you?
can see, when I dealt with the
Did
person...
they ask you who you wanted
No.
to play you?
No, but I liked Ron Silver, and I met him. My son really made the decision. He was the producer of the movie. And you know, you always overplay somebody because you have to do it very quickly, very dramatically. The opening scene has me throwing a telephone on the floor and smashing it when I've learned that I've lost the case. And as you can see, even when I'm dealing with that fellow from behind the room, I stay relatively calm in the face of conflict. I don't throw phones. Occasionally I throw fists. I recently, unfortunately, at the age of 75, I had to throw a fist. My son, who had just gotten out of the hospital, was attacked by somebody in New York, and the person threw a punch at my son, and I was there, and I wound up and punched her, knocked his glasses off, and he ran away, and my son felt so bad, he said, "I'm supposed to be defending you, Dad. You're an old man, and here you are." The wrist still hurts, but, you know, attack my son, and you're going to get it. So it's you know, Red Auerbach was just remarkable.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Professor Dershowitz, I'm a student of philosophy here at Suffolk. Last semester I took an ethics class where I read a lot of your essays.
Right.
And I want to go to law school after I graduate here. After I graduate from here, I would like to ask you, at what point in your life did you realize you wanted to become a lawyer?
I never had a choice. My rabbi was right. I had a big mouth. I was always contentious, always arguing, always disagreeing. You know, I come from a tradition of questioning everything. And so being a lawyer was the most natural thing in the world for me. I never thought of another career. Of course, being a lawyer meant being a criminal defense lawyer. I never knew there was anything else. I mean, who would ever dream as a kid of being a corporate lawyer? I wanted to be the guy who got all the innocent people off. It never occurred to me that I'd spend my life also getting some guilty people off. But by the way, just one word about that. Harvey has written this brilliant book, 3 Felonies a Day, and he makes a terrific point. But the truth remains that at least in the state system, for the most part, when it comes to crimes like murder and robbery and rape, the vast majority of people who are tried for crimes are probably guilty, if not of that crime, of some closely related crime, probably of that crime. And thank God for that. Would anybody want to live in a country where the majority of people charged with a crime were innocent? I mean, that would be Iran, that would be China. It would not be the United States of America. And the job of the criminal defense lawyer is to keep it that way, to make sure that we press the government on every single case, to make sure that nothing gets permitted to be entered into evidence without objection. I mean, that's why this FISA court is such a phony, the NSA FISA court, because it's not a court. Nobody presents the other side. It's all ex parte, one-sided. You need an adversarial system. There's a story in the Talmud that says when a Sanhedrin, which was the court in the ancient land of Israel, when a Sanhedrin unanimously, without dissent, sentenced somebody to death, on the same day that the evidence was heard, there must be a new trial, because something is wrong if so hastily they concluded he was guilty without even an opposing view being expressed. And, you know, the Bible has Abraham arguing with God over the sinners of Sodom. So the role of the defense attorney is to press the government, to constantly keep pressure on it, to make sure that only the guilty are prosecuted. And Harvey's book shows that in the federal system, that hasn't happened. That laws are so elastic and so vague that innocent people are caught up in the process, and we have to make sure that that doesn't happen. Better 10 guilty go free than 1 innocent be wrongly confined. Yeah.
I just saw something on the news before I came over here about the victims of Whitey Bulger, and they were saying this idea that I'm going to get $40,000 from this money that they found at Whitey Bulger's apartment. I should be getting more than that because the government covered up what Whitey Bulger did. I think it's important for people who are culpable within the governmental system to pay for their actions that they took as using their authority in bad ways, because otherwise the rest of us innocent taxpayers have to pay for their mistakes. So I think it's important that we do something, and I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV. I think it's important that we change some laws so that if people act with ill will and do things like these people did in the FBI,
Well,
that
I think
we
you have
can
a point.
prosecute them.
I think
I
you have
really do.
I think you have a point. You know, Nancy Gertner, when she was a judge, ruled and gave a very large judgment against some of the people who were put in jail knowingly, falsely, people who to cover up for Whitey Bulger. That is, I think 4 people were sentenced for a murder to jail and served. One of them died, I think, in jail. Some of them spent long times in jail for a crime that the government knew Whitey Bulger,
Federal government.
the FBI knew Whitey Bulger had committed these crimes, and these were innocent people. But if the FBI came forward and said, we know that Whitey Bulger did it, they would have put Whitey Bulger in jail. That would have made Billy Bulger unhappy. It would have made them lose their jobs. And so they kept them in jail for all that period of time. I mean, this period of time in the FBI, and by the way, it wasn't only Connolly. It was a guy named Morris, and there were other FBI agents, and I think Jeremiah O'Sullivan, who were complicit in this cover-up. And many, many, many people suffered, and many people are still suffering from when the FBI, who will guard the guardians? You know, when the FBI does this, I remember when we first heard some of this stuff, we thought we would go to the FBI and report. And I'm glad we didn't, because it just would have gotten right back. And that was the problem. When anybody told anything to the FBI, it went right back through Billy Bulger to Whitey Bulger. That was the method of communication. And you know, thank God that era is over. I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. Boston is a great, great city. I think it's over that period. I'm so pleased that I have spent my career here. Boston has been wonderful to me. I'm going to continue to come back to Boston frequently. I'm keeping my office at Harvard Law School. I may come back and teach some freshman seminars, but I am looking forward to my next career, my next phase in my career. And any of you who are concerned that I'm leaving, know that Harvey is my better than replacement. He's here to protect all of our civil liberties, all of our human rights, all of our individual rights. Harvey is one of the most remarkable imports from Boston to Brooklyn, and I hope you all appreciate him and continue to appreciate him for many, many years to come. Thank you, Harvey.